4 years ago, I watched Mamoru Hosoda's Bell and really didn't like it and made a review about that. That opinion was not aligned with the general consensus about Bell. A lot of people really loved that movie. A few days ago, I watched Mamoru Hosoda's Scarlet, a movie that got significantly worse reception than Bell. I'm not setting up some crazy reversal here, though, because I also don't think it's very good. However, it is interesting, but I wish it was more weird and more interesting. But I guess I do have at least a couple things to say about it, so here's a quick review. I kind of don't like doing reviews that are just comparing something to something else, but Belle was heavily inspired by Beauty and the Beast, and Scarlet is very heavily inspired by Hamlet. The names of many of the characters are just directly the names of characters from Hamlet. The setup of the plot is just the plot of Hamlet. It's not really being shy about it. But I think in its overall attempt at a message about violence and forgiveness, there's one very interesting change from Hamlet that the movie makes that I just wish I felt like actually meant more overall. You have, evil uncle betrays king, gets him killed. Child of the former king wants revenge on the evil uncle. In this case, that's Scarlet, not Hamlet. But in this case, the former king is depicted as only the nicest, most forgiving, most honorable guy possible. All the people love him, and there's an active revolt after he's killed. I think it's sort of important to note that we're adapting Hamlet into a story about, violence, but also in forgiveness. Hamlet doesn't so much have that. The dead king in Hamlet is not depicted as a great peacemaker through his generosity. If you'd ever consider him a peacemaker, it's a peacemaker through war and conquest. Hamlet still loved him and still wants revenge, but there's just not at all the same sense that the dead king in Hamlet was this paragon of virtue and selflessness. So I think that was an interesting thing that I was considering while watching the movie. Because by changing some of the circumstances, you end up changing what messages you can have. Though, of course, Scarlet is changing a lot of other circumstances, like most of the movie taking place in a sort of hellscape afterlife. So that leads into my, actual gripe with the movie. I just wish the movie was more interesting overall. The trailers make it look interesting. There's certainly parts that are interesting, and other parts that are interesting in a negative connotation, because I sure wouldn't have done that. You certainly can't say that this movie was, designed by a committee and that's why it's bad. There's quite a few creative decisions in here that I can't see any committee or corporate entity saying, oh yeah, we gotta do this, the fans will love it. There's definitely a creative vision here. But the creative vision is a lot of times beautiful in terms of visuals, but boring in terms of execution. The opening and quite a lot of shots used in the trailers use the afterlife setting for some truly interesting imagery. You've got Scarlet. I almost called her Belle. I mean, 2 movies in a row you have a pink-haired protagonist. You have Scarlet being dragged down, held to the ground by a bunch of clawing zombie hands. You have this desolate hellscape. The ground looks like a close-up of a human heart with veins running over it. But a lot of the time in the afterlife, there's just a bunch of desert. There's very pretty, photorealistic ruined buildings. There's lots of nice scenery, nice desolate scenery at least. It really doesn't use its setting to, tell more about the story. It's desolate. And I don't think I could get much out of how anything is presented besides it's desolate for most of the time. The opening imagery, lots of good stuff, but doesn't really coalesce into anything that I found particularly moving. And a lot of the time in the middle was just not particularly interesting to look at. I could also mention that a lot of the action scenes and such were done with 3D models. I personally think they looked fine. Scarlet just sort of goes for a bunch of different art styles. There is general cohesion between art styles for different locations, different real world versus imagination versus the afterlife stuff, but it's a lot going on is what I'm trying to say. But that lot going on is just unfortunately not a super interesting lot going on. So the other thing I want to compare this movie to, besides Hamlet, is the anime Angel Beats, which also takes place in an afterlife and has a bunch of different themes, but actually has a lot going on in a way that I found quite compelling. And it's also just a huge mess of stuff. So I'm not gonna die on a hill saying that Angel Beats was a super amazing show that has no valid criticism of it, because it's not. But it does a lot of stuff that's very weird, and has a few very specific things that felt extremely similar to a couple plot beats in Scarlet. Not gonna get into spoiling both that series and the movie to say what those are. If you've seen them both, I think you'll immediately recognize them. Despite that being a 12-episode series, it just felt like there was a lot more going on, and also a lot more going on, like, thematically with the same premise. Now, obviously, Angel Beats, it's well known for its tone being all over the place. One minute you have comedy, the next minute you have everyone dead in a giant pool of blood. Or sometimes you have characters being killed for comedy, a bit easier to do when they're not actually, like, dead when they're killed a second time. Whereas Scarlet's afterlife, you do disappear if you're killed in the afterlife. But overall, Angel Beats, despite all of its mess and inconsistent tone, which of course I'm partially comparing to Scarlet because Scarlet has some hugely dramatic tone shifts as well. There was definitely a couple scenes I would never have guessed would show up in the movie, but they're certainly there. The overall Angel Beats at the end of the series, I felt like it meant something and it had thematic depth, whereas Scarlet, it wears its ideas on its sleeve. You don't have to dig for the depth, but I just also think that makes it far less interesting. I'll cut off this tangent about Angel Beats. I've written like 10,000 words or something, a script trying to analyze Angel Beats that I've never actually done anything with, so I could say a whole lot more, but overall Scarlet is a weird movie that I'm glad to have watched, so way better than Belle in that aspect. At no point did it make me angry, but it's definitely an odd film. Watch it if you want to see an odd film. I don't even think a rating can really sum it up, because yeah, it's probably a 5 out of 10 film, but at the same time, I wanted to make sure to watch Scarlet because it was a poorly received film. There's a lot of poorly received movies that are actually very interesting. Anyway, I finally found a motivation to make a review of another movie. Just a lot of stuff doesn't actually pan through from thinking about what to say about it to actually publishing anything. Like, I saw both Little Amelie, or The Character of Rain, and Arco. Both of those are nominated for Best Animated Feature at the upcoming Academy Awards. And ultimately, I just didn't have very much to say about either of those. So here's your quick bonus review. Little Amelie is like an interesting story. I didn't personally think it was amazing, but it was interesting. Meanwhile, Arco I found pretty disappointing. Frankly, I thought it just sort of went through a bunch of stuff in the story, but at the end I felt like the characters really hadn't meaningfully shown any growth, and the story hadn't gone anywhere particularly interesting. After watching, I walked out thinking, how did that get nominated? Anyway, thank you for listening to this. Bye.